Hello everyone, this is your friend Shinobi Nexus 2.0 and we are back in new fanfic. What if Naruto was sent back to the third Shinobi War Part 2? What a slave driver. Kakashi cast a glance in the direction of that whisper. He wasn't planning to dwell on it, he had heard much worse, but the person who made the comment seemed to gag up at being caught. The young Chunin's face turned red and then white, looking as if Kakashi had done an unimaginable terror on him with just a glare. Now, the air around them turned stale. We haven't rested for an entire day, the Chunin said, a little louder, finding courage in releasing what had been bottled up. Not all of us are perfect machines like you that feel no fatigue. Some of our teammates are still recovering from injuries. Just then, Kakashi raised his hand to signal a pause in their journey and halted his movement. He turned around to face his team fully and sure enough, the Chunin that voiced his dissent averted his gaze. The courage finally ran out, it seemed, but nevertheless, extended a hand to help another shinobi steady himself. Sukuzu was it, despite being the same age as Kakashi, and therefore likely to have gone to the academy with him. He had no recollection of who he was aside from the mission summary. Back then, Kakashi had no Sharingan that forced every detail of his life down his throat. He was prideful and really only remembered those that had traits worthy of being remembered. Guy was exceptional at taijutsu. Asuma was ambidextrous and above average with weapons. Kurenai's genjutsu could put shinobi twice her age to the test. Obito was loud, stubborn, and a sticky piece of tape that Kakashi couldn't get rid of. Those that Kakashi didn't remember, then, were those that didn't stand out to him back in the days, those that were unremarkable in Kakashi's narrow field of vision. Are you injured? Kakashi asked all of a sudden. No, Sukuzu stuttered. Kakashi thought that this was getting annoying. Then those that are recovering from injuries can speak for themselves, Kakashi said with a flat voice. Then, he looked around and asked, anyone? Nobody said a word. The other Chunin, who was clearly Suzuku's friend, tugged on his arm and shook his head, telling him to let go. Not with Hatake Kakashi. His face seemed to say, it's useless. Make camps. We'll rest until sunrise, then we'll head towards the second village. Kakashi issued his order and immediately, he saw a flash of relief on quite a few of his teammates' faces. Half a year ago, inexperienced Chunin, like Sukuzu, and those that were recovering from minor injuries, like Kakashi and some of those assigned here, would be on the battlefield, fighting for their lives while battles stretched for days. But 4 months ago, Iwa had agreed to a truce in defeat. They had been faltering in strength ever since the fall of Canopy Bridge. Suna retreated from the international conflict as soon as their feud with Iwa had settled. Konoha was never its direct enemy anyway. Kiri was on its last leg, even more so now that their crazy plan had ended not in the destruction of Konoha, but the loss of their tailed beast. Only Kumo still had the strength and pride left to fuel the flame at the Fire Thunder war front. Konoha no longer needed to ward off enemies from all directions, so it could afford to send some of its battle-capable forces, defined by the fact that one could hold a kunai and stab, really, on missions less suicidal. So now, they had the luxury to stroll through Fire Country's forest, resting whenever they wanted, and complaining about strict leadership when they only had to deal with bandits. What a progress. I'm patrolling ahead, Kakashi said, catching the attention of everyone settling down while he clearly had no intention of doing so. Well then, those that are not recovering from injuries, pull your weight and guard the camp. Suzuku gave out a tiny shudder. Really? This was getting old. Wait up, Kakashi. Let me come with you. Kakashi couldn't help but raise an eyebrow when he heard Asuma calling at him, waving his hand that had 2 broken fingers in a cast. Wouldn't it be more logical for more than one shinobi to handle scouting? Unable to find a point to reject, Kakashi nodded and let Asuma follow him out of the camp. 5 minutes later, he was thinking that it might have been a mistake. Kakashi drew blood on his thumb and slapped his hand into the ground, and two puppies, one with orange furs and another with a gray pelt, appeared in front of him. Shiba, Garuko, please keep vigilance around the camp and notify me if anything happens, Kakashi asked, and the pups shook their tails in response. Garuko, the youngest of his pack, looked at him expectantly. Kakashi gave in and rubbed his hand over the pup's head. Oh, if only our teammates can see what I'm seeing. Asuma let out a chuckle and Kakashi rolled his eyes. I know you don't have to, but if you just explain a little more, maybe they'll figure out that you were planning to set up a resting point all along. Why do I care? Kakashi landed on a branch, surveying his surroundings with his Sharingan, letting the smell of the forest and everything in it fill his nose. It's not like I planned it for their sake. I doubt the villagers would appreciate Shinobi that arrived at the dead of the night. I doubt they'll appreciate our presence even when the sun is bright. Asuma let out a sigh and Kakashi wanted to do the same. The first village they went to were fearful of them. Suspicion filled their eyes until it was replaced by tired, festering anger. When Kakashi repeated, according to his mission objective, that they really should consider relocating, one of the older villagers snapped back and asked them, "Do you think we'll still be here if we can help it?" While Kakashi knew that this anger would have been directed at anyone that came, even if it wasn't him, he seriously doubted that his cold and impersonal demeanor helped much. For a second, he lowered his gaze and couldn't help but think that if Rin or Obito were here, hell, even Guy and his overly cheerful eyebrows, they would have done a much better job than he ever could. But they weren't here and Kakashi would help Minato-sensei by completing whatever was assigned to him. Not a fault should ever be picked of his teacher, not at this critical time. You said the journey is difficult because of the danger on the road. There were many things that had stopped the villagers from leaving, whether for reallocation or just the trade for essentials and livelihood, so Kakashi picked out the one that they could help as a shinobi. We'll make sure they're not a bother anymore, to the best of our abilities. That led to a hunt around the region that lasted 16 hours as they slowly moved towards the second village on their list of visits. So you must have been knocked real good if even you are slotted to this type of mission, Asuma commented, keeping up with Kakashi's speed as they breezed through the forest, trying to caution against any signs of life, equivalent to trouble in their book. Kakashi wanted to disagree with that. While the chakra exhaustion still made him feel like his circuit was over-fried, preventing him from using large-scale ninjutsu, he was doing fine, well enough to make quick works of rampant bandits in the area, and certainly well enough to return to the actual battlefields. Rather than worrying about me, why don't you make sure that you can do more than maiming petty bandits with only one good hand? Kakashi retorted back, making Asuma bring his fist up, the good one, as if he wanted to punch him. You can be real haughty with your mouth, you know that. Asuma said with a click of his tongue. Kakashi did know that, he just never felt the need to address that, not before, and not ever. That made those who were still willing to interact with him, Rin, Guy, and to some extent, Asuma and Kurenai, quite a rare and strange species amongst his peers. Asuma would have continued giving him a piece of his mind, but he knew that Kakashi would just turn his body away, ignoring him with no shame. However, this time, Kakashi didn't turn to face the other way just to irk Asuma. He tugged at the fabric covering his lower face. Instinct made him want to pull it higher, but the logical shinobi in him forced him to loosen it instead, so he could better catch the faint, obnoxious scent in the forest. Kakashi knew that burning mugwort leaves was a common practice among civilians living in this region. So despite their versatile usage, mugwort was often called the leaves of passing. Kakashi had no opinions of their superstition, but he did find their smell to be disgustingly pungent for his sensitive nose. He wasn't sure if it was because dried leaves were only burned along with corpses, but so many unpleasant stenches were mixed with their bitter smell. The decay of the rotten flesh, the sting of scorching fire and is that the smell of blood? There are people burning corpses using mugwort leaves not far away, Kakashi commented. Asuma was surprised for only a moment before he shrugged it off. We're close to the second village, aren't we? They must be burning their deceased. Asuma looked somewhat worried, but only because death would make a village agitated and certainly less receptive to their mission. There's also the scent of blood floating in the forest, Kakashi added. His nose was very good, a blessing given by both his Hitaki heritage and his contract with the Ninkins, but not without limitations. For him to catch that whiff of metallic scent despite seeing nothing in sight, a good amount would have to be spilled. Oh crap, did that village get attacked by bandits? Asuma rubbed his hair in panic. That seemed like the most obvious guess, Kakashi agreed. So immediately, he pressed his thumb into the ground and let the summoning array expand. With a small poof, Pakun stared at Kakashi with his droopy eyes that made the bulldog look like he was about to fall asleep anytime. Pakun, can you return to the camp and tell them to head for the village, scout first and don't do anything stupid. Just follow the origin of the mugwort smoke. Pakun took a sniff, marking the scent in his brain. Then, with a nod, he ran back in the direction they came from. Rest time was over. Kakashi seriously hoped that his teammates, however whiny they were, knew their priority and wouldn't question his order just because a dog delivered it. Let's go. Kakashi bolted into the distance while Asuma followed not far behind. The two of them, despite the glitchy chakra system and 2 broken fingers, should be more than enough to deal with a group of bandits. Soon enough, things started to feel off. The scent of the blood was diverging from that of the mugwort smoke. At first, it was just a small misalignment, but now it was at the point where Kakashi had to pick one to pursue in favor of the other. He chose the trail of blood, wondering what he would find: survivors, or their attackers. Duck. Kakashi's Sharingan flashed red before he flickered down from the branch. Immediately, a wave of Senbon sailed above the branch, almost taking off a patch of Asuma's hair had he not heeded Kakashi's warning. What was that? Asuma pushed the words out of his teeth, but Kakashi had already seen everything he could. 2 enemies, coming at them from the same direction. Their jackets were the shades of green that would blend well in Fire Country's forest, and their headbands blatantly displayed the Konoha insignia. Kakashi's breath halted for that moment. Rather than feeling relieved at the sight of comrades, his muscle grew tenser under the strange sight. Hey, watch before you attack someone from the same village, Asuma said, trying to fake that tone of relief despite gripping the trench knife behind his back. The shinobi glanced at them, at their naive and subpar performance, and the next thing that graced Kakashi's vision was a vortex of water. They were imposters and not the origin of the bloody smell. Kakashi escaped the pressurized waves by jumping onto a branch. His toes touched the surface for a moment before he flickered again. Barely a second later, the tree broke under the force of the water. Catch the runaways, Kakashi managed to read the lips of one of the shinobi. Sure enough, his teammate made a sharp turn, wanting to get ahead of the point of conflict. Without wasting a beat, Kakashi brought his hand to his mouth as he sucked in a breath. A series of wind bullets rushed out of Kakashi's mouth with a bang. Some of them aimed for the shinobi trying to get away, while others scattered all around him. With a quick reflex, the shinobi maneuvered out of the way, escaping direct hits with no more than a shallow laceration on her shoulder. Still, Kakashi's wind bullet broke apart the earth and snapped the trees on the shinobi's path, delaying her ever so slightly. But before Kakashi could catch up, he felt the puddle beneath his sandal stir. Instinct took over and Kakashi stepped to the side, barely avoiding the tendrils of water that reached out for his ankle. A heavy crash sounded to the side and Kakashi caught Asuma hitting the tree trunk. At least his teammate was well enough to let out a curse. The enemy shinobi also had a scorch mark near his collar, speaking of Asuma's brave, but clearly unsuccessful, attempt of using fire jutsu against an expert of water release. Kakashi flickered to the shinobi's back in the blink of an eye. A kunai slid out of his arm guard as he stabbed it forward, aiming straight for the back of the shinobi's head. Clink. Metals clashed together when his enemy caught the attack with his own kunai at the last second. Kakashi wasn't fazed. Quiet as a snake, he reached forward with his other arm, locking onto the shinobi's elbow. With a twist of his hand, the enemy's balance faltered just a bit, giving Kakashi an opening to send his knee straight toward the shinobi's stomach. The shinobi stumbled backward, but not before he sent the kunai forward with a flick of his wrist, creating distance between them. Kakashi let the kunai fly past his face, refusing to move his gaze away from his target despite how close the blade was to his eyes. Lightning crackled on Kakashi's kunai, wrapping the cold metal in streams of surging electricity. The flash from the lightning lit up their faces in the dark. Without staring into Kakashi's Sharingan, the shinobi stomped the forest floor. A wall of earth sprung up from the ground, raising an immovable blockade around the shinobi. But Kakashi was always bold, sometimes to the point of obstinate, with his lightning, and he charged forward without a second of pause. The blade made of lightning dug into the thick wall. Kakashi's hand gripped the hilt of the kunai tighter when his attack was met with resistance. He poured his strength in, ignoring the way his chakra system complained, and with a crack, the lightning slashed through the earth wall. Kakashi only had the time to narrow his eyes before water burst through the crumbling stones. Layers of water reached out towards Kakashi with hunger, and through the Sharingan, he could see that the liquid was brimming with chakra. The waves curved around him and the tendrils latched onto each other, clearly trying to cage him in a water prison. Out of nowhere, a pair of shurikens sliced through the air, buzzing with the noise of the wind currents clashing with each other. Wind chakra wrapped around the pair of shuriken, shredding into the water prison with deadly precision, breaking down its integrity before it could fully form. Kakashi had to duck a little to avoid a shuriken that had gone off course, but otherwise, the timing was as perfect as anyone could ask. Stupid aim, Asuma muttered, but that was to be expected when he was 2 fingers short of a proper grip. Asuma was only distracted for a second to escape the residual electricity leaking into the splashing water, and to his horror, or amazement, Kakashi was nowhere to be seen when he focused his eyes again. Oh well, it wasn't so much Asuma's problem as it was their enemies. Inhale. Before a breath was fully drawn, Kakashi rose from under the ground. Like a panther pouncing on its prey, Kakashi struck his kunai forward, slicing through the shinobi's right shoulder and down his back. Blood sprayed all over Kakashi's mask as he kicked the shinobi in the knee and forced him down on the ground. The tip of his kunai pricked into the skin behind the shinobi's neck. A layer of water submerged his enemy's face as well as Kakashi's ankle. The residual electricity numbed his sensations ever so lightly, but it was tolerable. Who are you and what are you here for? Kakashi tried his best, even leaving the shinobi enough breath to finish a sentence, all against his instinct. Asuma jumped down from the branch just as the shinobi drew a raspy breath. At that second, Kakashi saw it, the cold, ruthless gaze in their opponent's eyes, as well as the glint of something shiny in the shinobi's mouth. Danger unlatched the leash Kakashi had on his instinct. He struck the shinobi's face as a Senbon shot out, missing Asuma's neck by a few inches. Simultaneously, Kakashi dug his kunai deeper into the shinobi's neck. What was that? Once again, Asuma repeated what he had asked at the beginning of the fight. Unfortunately, Kakashi didn't have a better answer than before, and he had just killed the person who had. But, Kakashi whipped his head around. There was another shinobi that ran away to chase someone. We need to hurry. Kakashi started running, knowing that Asuma would follow not far behind. He had a comrade that went ahead to chase the runaways, and that's the direction where the smell of blood is getting stronger. Aki was certain that if another one of those so-called shinobi came for them again, the same trick wouldn't work a second time. First of all, only one shinobi had caught them. If there were two, they'd be as good as dead. More importantly, the shinobi underestimated how unnatural Aki was, both in the mind and the body. Lastly, it just so happened that she got all she needed to mimic a spear. There was an old saying, an inch longer is an inch stronger. In the old era, spears were also called the weapon of war, not because of how many victories they guaranteed, but because of their ease of use even to untrained commoners. Its lengthy reach closed the disadvantage created by physical attributes, but only when it was within reasonable bounds. Many coincidences needed to culminate for that one moment to occur. With the way things were now, it couldn't be replicated. The blood that was once warm and flowing now turned cold and solid as it caked on her clothes and stuck to her skin. Despite that, Aki tightened her hold, hoping to grasp the only thing that mattered within her blood-stained fingers. It was somewhat ironic, then, when Haru's hand slipped out of her palm, made clammy by all the blood that rolled down from her arm. "Can you still run?" Aki asked, turning around for the first time since she took Haru and ran, since Haru followed silently. It was only then that she saw the small patch of crimson that blended into Haru's obi. "You're injured." Haru looked like she wanted to throw up. Sweats gathered on her forehead and her legs were shivering. Still, she placed a hand over her mouth to force nausea down and shook her head. She whispered, "Let's keep going." With a nod, Aki took Haru's hand once again and pulled her along their grand escape. Do we even have a chance to outrun them? This time, however, Haru didn't want to stay silent. Aki didn't have a definitive answer for that, but in all likelihood, not even in their dreams. She didn't even need to say that, because immediately, they heard the explosive clashes in the distance, an effect that could only be produced by the shinobi's ninjutsu. We're heading towards a ravine, a cliff that drops into the river. Haru clenched her teeth to steady her shaky voice. It wasn't very successful. A cliff, Aki slowed down for a moment, before she picked up her speed again, directly towards the ravine. Wait, that's the cliff. Haru opened her mouth, but Aki merely squeezed her hand, slippery, wet, and disgustingly bloody, and it seemed to reassure Haru's mind as well as her body. What Aki wanted was to throw them into a grand gamble. When death seemed inevitable, that was the only path where she saw a flickering chance. Soon, Aki could hear the sound of torrents splashing against rocks, getting louder and louder by the second. It didn't look like gods were on Haru's side, and heaven would not have cared. Aki saw the figure of a single pursuer that rushed out of the forest just when they arrived at the cliff. At least, luck had given them a small smile, and she had won the first gamble of many to come. The kunoichi stayed still for a moment, judging the two women in front of her, eventually resting her gaze on the makeshift spear that one of them held. Clearly, she found the body of her comrade and was trying to decide what to make of Aki. The silent judgment only lasted for a second before the kunoichi flicked her hand. Aki saw a fleeting shimmer and immediately, she twirled the spear like a fan. A series of light, cacophonous noises followed. In the span of a breath, the trees around them had stray needles sticking out of their bark. Oh, and the kunoichi zoomed toward them. Aki pushed Haru to the side and dug the end of her spear into the ground. With a forceful swing, the spear broke through the earth and sent a screen of debris straight at the kunoichi that reappeared in front of her. Both the surprise factor and the visual obstruction made the kunoichi pause in her advance. Not intending to let her recover, Aki turned the direction of the spear with a twist of the wrist and thrust it out again with a pivot of the body. The tip of the spear accelerated towards the kunoichi's torso like a dragon weaving through the clouds, pressuring the kunoichi to take another step back. Another swing of the spear followed in a fraction of a second, slicing up diagonally in one smooth sweep, but this time, the kunoichi caught it with the kunai in her hand and struck it back without mercy. Aki tightened the grip, her nails almost digging into the wooden shaft as she forcibly kept the spear in a defensive stance instead of letting it be swatted to the side. By now, the kunoichi had finally gotten over her surprise and started to realize that despite the skills that Aki had with spears, it wasn't enough to close the gap between their raw strength and speed. There it was again, a speed that Aki couldn't fully catch with her vision. Like a lithe leopard, the kunoichi jumped up with a turn and kicked down with her leg. By sheer reflex, Aki blocked the kick using the shaft of the spear, just barely. Without stopping, the shinobi hooked her shin around the spear and brought it down with a stomp. Aki could almost hear the fragility of her makeshift weapon when she pulled it against the kunoichi's hold and brought it to her chest. Then, it really wasn't a surprise when the kunai broke the shaft in half, leaving nothing between Aki and the kunoichi's bloodlust. It's all or nothing, Aki thought as she dropped the broken spear and instead thrust her palms forward. Her hands connected with the kunoichi's upper and lower arms as she pushed in the opposite direction. At the last second, Aki was able to bend the shinobi's arm from the elbow, making the kunai narrowly miss her heart. The blade dug into her lower lung, sentencing Aki to a slower and more agonizing death instead of a quick release. Aki was about to lunge forward while kunoichi was still debating whether she should add another strike. But suddenly, the kunoichi jolted back, releasing her weapon without any hesitation. In the blink of an eye, a flash of lightning pierced through where the kunoichi's head would be and hit the tree trunk with a sizzling crack. Electricity flickered around the stray kunai while Aki stole a glance in the direction of the intruders. Even with her senses, the visibility in the forest was pushing it. Nevertheless, she saw a mob of silver hair that popped up in the distance. It definitely brought back unpleasant memories. The kunoichi thought the same too, apparently. Quickly, she glanced at the fatal wound she just inflicted on Aki. Then, her eyes moved to search for her second target, Haru, who was hiding near the cliff, but nevertheless, rooted in place. The situation was changing too quickly for Aki to fully understand what was going on, but at least she knew that whoever was crashing the party was not the kunoichi's ally. She didn't know if Haru's chance of survival was higher with the newcomers, but she was certain that it was 0 with the kunoichi in front of them. With a single thought, the kunoichi could catch Haru and place her at blade point. It didn't matter if she wanted to kill Haru or take her hostage, the intruders wouldn't be fast enough to stop her. At the very least, Aki couldn't risk it. The gaping hole in her lung was starting to make breathing heavy labor, but somehow, Aki felt light on her feet. In the path that the kunoichi took to reach Haru, Aki reached out and locked the kunoichi's arm in her grip. The jagged rocks cracked from the edges of the cliff and the splashing water echoed louder, but none of that buried the deafening cry that sounded from above when Aki jumped down from the cliff, taking the kunoichi with her. Oh oh oh. Kakashi's hand moved without thinking when he threw the lightning-filled kunai toward the enemy shinobi. He had his Sharingan open, so he could see the contrast of chakra circuits in the scene in front of him. Compared to the bright and vigorous chakra circuit of the kunoichi that lit up like a torch in the dark, her praise were dim and impoverished, close to non-existent. Those were the civilian villagers, the ones that got away. At least, that was Kakashi's conclusion before he took a second look. The Sharingan remembered everything, and the night when Kakashi's hand had almost carved into Rin's chest was forever etched in his memory. Like a ghost, Kakashi was haunted once more when he saw the woman's face. The blood that soaked through her chest only added to the déjà vu. Aki. The scream was quite a contrast to Kakashi and Asuma's silent shock when they saw one of the women pulling the kunoichi down the ravine with her. Kakashi and Asuma glanced at each other before they flickered toward the cliff as fast as they could. Asuma grabbed the woman that was left above the cliff, making sure that she wouldn't slip down the ravine. Kakashi leaned over the edge, trying to catch any signs of life that had yet to be swept away and drowned out by the raging waves. He saw nothing but the turbulent river. But before he had the Sharingan, he had his nose. Asuma, watch the victim and get her to the rest of the team, Kakashi ordered, ignoring the way Asuma opened his eyes wide in disbelief, all the while signaling to the woman that was borderline hysteria. I'll be back. Kakashi needed answers, both for why the hell were enemy shinobi doing near a civilian village in Fire Country and for that day under the rain, where a tragedy was somehow derailed by an unexpected stroke of fate. Even if all he found were smashed up remains, he needed to see for himself. In truth, the unknown consequence of that mercy scared Kakashi. Single quote ... Unnatural. Single quote ... Foreign to us. Single quote ... Intrusion. Does not belong here. Aki gasped and immediately choked on a mouthful of water. Slowly, she pushed herself up from the shallow water bank. Strength and warmth were starting to return to her, and along with that, a reminder. The marking of black chains also rippled into existence on her skin. This time, she was certain that a few more cracks appeared on the chain links. For the first time in eons, the heavenly bindings around her left arm looked shaky. Aki raised a hand to her head, wanting to massage her skull but fished out nothing but clots of blood stuck to her hair. Yeah, she probably died by a smashed skull this time, when the current slapped them into the jagged rocks. Ouch, she wondered if that was why she was hearing things, whispers that didn't sound like whispers, messages that didn't make sense. Aki stood up from the chilly water, wondering where she was going this time. Now that she thought about it, she would soon have to discard the name, Aki, as well. I'm sorry, she whispered an apology to Haru, who wasn't here and whom she didn't plan to meet again. If there was any other way, she hoped that the last memory she had left the woman wasn't the one where she jumped off a cliff. But more than that, she hoped Haru would have a chance at living a full life, to see the end of the war and find a new beginning. Haru hadn't given up yet when fate took everything away from her. That strength was in her blood. A gaze latched into Aki, and she whipped her body around in alert. The branch fluttered up and down when the boy dropped onto the forest floor. The symbol of Tomo swirled in his left eye that glowed like the red moon. The boy was panting slightly, clearly the result of having to chase against the rapids. The moment the boy laid his eyes on her, Aki knew that he remembered. Shit. How did you survive? Aki wondered which event was the boy asking about, the one that occurred on the battlefield drenched in rain, or the one that he was witnessing in front of his eyes. She wasn't dumb enough to ignore the former, but neither was she bold enough to admit to it. The river isn't as harsh as one would think, Aki answered against the boy's searing gaze. Despite the mask that covered half of his face, she didn't miss his expression that said he'd be a fool to believe that. The boy merely shifted his gaze in a direction to her right. Aki followed his gaze and found the body that got washed up onto the opposite river bank. The kunoichi's back was bent in an unnatural shape and a bloody hole remained where her right shoulder should be. Aki sucked in a breath and returned her attention to the boy. Usually, people would call that karma, she said without any shame, the gods must have smiled upon me. The boy stayed speechless for a moment when he heard that. Perhaps he found the excuse to be too crappy. No, she was certain that it was crappy, but Aki could see the way his hand tensed behind his backhand. The boy bolted towards her, the cold steel in his hand looked like a black hole as it drilled towards her neck. Aki shifted half a step back, tension built in her legs as she bent her knees. Her hands were already in the motion of traveling up so that the heel of her palms would connect with the boy's wrist. All she needed was that burst of power, At the right angle, it could very well snap a body part as vulnerable as the wrist, then I can catch up to his speed. That realization ruined everything. Her movement paused for a fleeting moment and the blade arrived before her hands did. She could feel the chilling cold radiating off of the metal, but that was it. It never ventured farther than that, not even drawing a faint red line on her skin. The boy stopped his attack at the last moment and the killing intent faded. It was then that Aki realized that this was a test, a very convincing one. By the looks of it, the boy saw something that surprised him. With another beat of the heart and the boy retreated like an agile wolf. Aki exhaled, letting her hands relax from the defensive stance, all the while the boy observed. I don't see it, the boy muttered, the pattern in his red eye spun in a slow circle. You defended like a shinobi, but I don't see any flares in your chakra, I don't see any chakra in you at all. Who are you? Finally, the boy asked the overarching question. Aki could see the caution in his eyes, stemming from the fear of the unknown. His fingers gripped tightly on the kunai, telling her that the moment this perceived risk of the unknown tipped over his nerve, he would put those blades to use and not as a test either. She supposed that the real question he wanted to ask was, what are you? Aki had been wondering what these so-called shinobi were like in this world. She wondered what became of this group of people that could wield supernatural powers but still yielded under the feudal lords with political influence and wealth. Now that she had seen some examples, she couldn't say that she was surprised. I don't remember, but of course, you're not going to believe me, Aki answered, and the boy narrowed his eyes dangerously before she even finished her sentence. The unfortunate truth was that no matter what she said, it wasn't going to placate the young shinobi in front of her. So, Aki asked a question of her own. What did I ever do to you, or your allegiance, whatever, to deserve this? Endless compromise on one end did not make good grounds for negotiation, after all. It was a rare moment indeed when the threats seemed stuck on the young shinobi's tongue. From my perspective, the village I was staying at got attacked by the shinobi that were supposed to protect them, so I fought back using what I have, Aki continued, pointing at the battered corpse of the kunoichi in the distance. The two of you have the same symbol on your headbands. Do you belong to the same allegiance? Of course not. Konoha would never attack the citizens of Fire Country. They're merely imposters. The young boy gritted his teeth as mild anger leaked out of his voice. Enemies then, Aki concluded before the boy could get another word in. So, I failed to see what harm I have caused your Konoha. See, Aki doubted that she would be able to convince the young boy to let her go on her merry ways. He was barely a teenager but was already a determined warrior with fierce loyalty. But at least he talked before moving to cut her down, even getting a little flustered when she questioned the morality of his actions. The boy could still question the basis of his actions, not just a mindless machine that cut down everything that was frightening. So perhaps, he could be reasoned with, no matter how limited that leeway seemed to be. The boy remained silent as he contemplated her words and debated his next action. Very lightly, Aki stretched her hands, closing them into a fist before opening them again. Was it her imagination? No, something had truly returned. If it was what she suspected it to be, then maybe what she needed to do was to bid her time. So, she raised her eyes again and repeated, I might be different, but have I caused you any harm that would equate my difference to danger? Perhaps she was reaching when the world she landed in was already too jaded by turmoils. But just when she thought that nothing would happen, the boy lowered his kunai and placed it back in his weapon holder. His hand still glossed over the hilt of the kunai, his body remained in a battle stance, vigilant of any changes around him. But finally, Aki felt like she was being seen as something more sentient than an inexplicable threat. Oh, what did I ever do to you, or your allegiance, whatever, to deserve this? The woman had asked Kakashi when he was trying to understand everything that he had seen, the facts that refused to align with reality no matter how hard he tried to make sense of them. Kakashi was certain that he had once driven a Chidori through her chest, while his Sharingan watched. Illusions were supposed to dissolve away under the Sharingan, so what kind of genjutsu was this? What kind of horror story was this? To see the ghost standing in front of him, back to life from not just from Chidori, but also a suicidal fall. So, naturally, Kakashi's first thought was that the woman had some ninjutsu that was beyond his imagination. That was fine, as long as he could see it, to be sure of its existence, and he would work from there to figure out a counter. Kakashi thought about letting his blade continue on its course when he saw the woman moving to defend herself. He could see the trajectory well, she was aiming for his wrist as an experienced fighter would. So much for a cover as a civilian, he supposed. But then, he saw the deadness in her supposed chakra circuit, like a stagnant pond with no ripple. It told Kakashi that the woman was not using her chakra to match against a shinobi's chakra-enhanced speed. She was like a shape covered by a layer of black ink and Kakashi couldn't discern any light that passed through. Kakashi stopped his blade, wondering for a very brief second, what the hell was he doing and what was it that he drew a blade against? A shinobi, a civilian, an unknown. Have I caused you any harm that would equate my difference to danger? Kakashi heard the question again. Not yet, but you might in the future. The moment that those words surfaced in Kakashi's mind, he realized the fallacy. He wasn't making a judgment based on reason or logic, but rather, on a sense of fear towards something he couldn't understand. Apply the rule of precaution like what a shinobi is taught to do. Cut it down and kill that uncertainty, be it 99% or 1%. That would be an easy way to do things, a way that didn't require Kakashi to think so hard on his decisions, a way to guard against failures. Alas, Kakashi found himself to be thinking a lot more after Obito's death, for better or worse. Return to Konoha with us for questioning. If you do so without causing any trouble, no harm will come to you on the way, Kakashi said, feeling the weight of the kunai not in his hand, but in the weapon holder hanging on his thigh. If you truly mean no ill intention towards Konoha, we won't treat you as an enemy either. She wasn't an enemy, not yet. As she said, she had not caused any harm to Konoha or Kakashi and neither did she show any intention, not yet. If anything, her unexplained ruse had prevented Rin's death. There weren't enough facts for Kakashi to judge her future, and certainly not enough reason for Kakashi to turn to his fear for an answer. What about the other survivor from the village? What will become of her? The woman asked as she considered his words. Kakashi thought back to the scene above the cliff and he remembered the other prey that the kunoichi was hunting, the one with an impoverished, but normal chakra circuit. If she's just a civilian, no harm will come to her either. After what happened, it's safer for her to come with us to Konoha. Kakashi couldn't help but let out a small frown when he was reminded of the more immediate threat at hand. Kakashi didn't forget that he also came to look for clues about the imposters. They dressed up as Konoha shinobi, but instead of trying to wreak havoc in Konoha's defense, they chose to attack a civilian village. For what? To plunder a village battered by war. Would that make them more likely to be a band of missing nin rather than a force from a major shinobi village? Unfortunately, by the looks of it, he would only get another dead body that couldn't talk. The woman was about to open her mouth to reply, but she was interrupted when they heard the rattling noise behind the treeline. Pakun jumped out of the bushes and stopped at Kakashi's feet. You need to go see the village, Kakashi. When we arrived, there was no sign of any attackers, Pakun told him in a stern voice. Even as he turned to examine the woman standing in front of them, he didn't stop in his report. The only thing left is burnt corpses. As you wish, I'll come with you to Konoha, the woman said. It was hard for Kakashi to tell what she was thinking about when she heard the news. So, Kakashi just nodded. We'll have to make a stop at the village first. He was still so uncertain and he couldn't help but add a threat at the end of the sentence. If you try anything funny, I'll make sure that you stay dead, no matter what tricks you have. Fair enough, the woman replied, picking up her steps to follow Pakun as he led the way back to the village. I trust that you'll judge my innocence, or guilt, if you prefer that connotation, with care, Shinobi-san. Kakashi didn't feel any trust from that tone. Then again, it wasn't like he needed any. Oh, Aki heard the painful cries before anything came into view. Whimpers traveled across the forest, the volume was muffled by the distance, but the emotions carried through the space, relaying the heartbreak and rage with clarity. What did we do to deserve this? What did we do wrong to deserve all of this? Haru screamed, presumably at the shinobi who could offer no answer. You shinobi just come in, bringing your conflict with you. If our lives are already so insignificant to you, then why are they taken away for the sake of your war? We would never think your lives to be insignificant. That's not. I'm sorry for all of this, another boy replied, sounding flustered, anxious, and just generally unsure of what to do. For a second, Aki just paused. She, too, was uncertain of how Haru would react if she returned, alive, unharmed, and breaking all facades of normalcy. The boy with silver hair tilted his head a little, observing Aki with his sharp gaze. There was a silent judgment in his eyes, asking if Aki would break her promise. Without another moment wasted, Aki pushed past the bushes and headed for the open. Aki had spent so many years, decades, centuries even, blending in unnoticed that she was mildly startled when multiple pairs of eyes landed on her. But really, only one of those pairs mattered for the time being. The boiling emotions in Haru seemed to die down for a moment as she looked at Aki with disbelief. A step forward, and then two. Aki felt the weight on her bones when Haru locked her in an embrace. Fingers glossed over the wet fabric on her back before Haru pulled her even tighter. It took Aki a moment to realize that Haru wouldn't let go until she got some kind of indication that Aki was real. I survived, Aki said. No blessing from the gods, no smile of luck. She said none of that. Aki felt Haru nodding against her shoulder. That's all I need to know, the woman muttered in a whisper, releasing Aki from her hold. Kakashi, there's no trace of anyone left when we got here. We have to put out the funeral pyre, but that's all we can salvage. Aki saw the young shinobi walking towards the village gate while his teammate, the one with spiky black hair, debriefed him. Lightly, Aki rubbed Haru's wrist as a sign of comfort, before she let go and headed for the village gate as well. Wait, it's not a pretty sight, you shouldn't, one of the shinobi called out from the side when he finally registered where Aki was heading, but it was already too late. Aki saw the burnt corpses piling up in the village gate, charred, disfigured, and unrecognizable. Do any of those corpses belong to Matsu-san? And her husband who sought out Haru just hours earlier? Even Aki could help but avert her eyes for a moment. When she did, she saw the supply of mugwort leaves left behind by the firewood, making her more aware of the smoke that seemed to veil the village. Asuma, what's the state inside the houses? The young shinobi named Kakashi asked as he knelt down and examined the bodies. His brows were furrowed as if he was pissed off at the lack of clues that could be picked up by his eyes. Nothing out of the ordinary. There are no marks of blood or any signs of conflict, the other shinobi, Asuma, answered. He eyed Aki with uncertainty but decided not to mention it when his leader, supposedly, didn't care. The villagers are incapacitated and killed with efficiency. The corpses were then being disposed of in a meticulous manner befitting of the local custom so as to not arouse any suspicion, Kakashi analyzed, standing up and placing his hand on his mask. This is a planned assault, and by a group that's highly organized. For what? What do they have to gain by making this village disappear? Asuma looked confused as if he couldn't fathom why so much effort had gone into killing a civilian village when it was neither a critical ally of the shinobi force nor a strategic point for border defense. Aki turned her head back a little, eyeing Haru's direction, who had stayed outside of the village walls, unable to take another look at the massacre. With a light inhale, she spoke up, "We have nothing that's worthy of being taken. We had no money, harbored no shinobi, and held no resources that could help in your war." Now, she certainly had all the attention of the two shinobi in front of her. "All we have are our lives and our identity as civilian citizens of Fire Country." The knight turned eerie at her words, but not as eerie as when Aki realized that if they just forget the Konoha shinobi and then buried the bodies out of sight, when the mist from the mugwort smoke thinned with the morning breeze, the village would look as it had been the day before. It was as if time had paused for a few seconds before things started to move in motion. "Asuma, call your hawk. We're facing a scheme of infiltration and Konoha needs to get notified as soon as possible," the silver-haired shinobi ordered, pulling out a paper scroll from his pack. The other boy whistled with a piercing noise, then he asked, "Are you sure, Kakashi? To impersonate a whole village of civilians in advance in Fire Country, that requires every one of that platoon to be an expert in disguise and espionage. That's a hefty number of spies for a shinobi village to gather in one place when there aren't many, to begin with." "I'm not sure, but as things stand, that's the most reasonable speculation and one that can have devastating consequences if left unprepared," Kakashi answered as the screech of a hawk closed in from the background. The boy extended his arm and the hawk landed on his arm with a flap of its wings. "Imagine if we didn't catch this. Imagine if another day had passed and the team of shinobi, consisting of inexperienced chunin and those suffering from injuries and fatigue, found the village and its inhabitants with nothing out of ordinary. They'll be able to relocate to towns closer to the capital and closer to Konoha, with proper identities vouched for by our own shinobi." "You," Asuma scratched his head, sounding beyond stressed and frustrated. "They're not playing by the rules. Shinobi warfare should have stayed away from civilians. I can think of at least one shinobi village that's desperate enough to try anything," Kakashi said while securing the scroll onto the hawk's leg. "The major villages can't even uphold signed treaties. What do you expect when the rules are just implicit agreements?" This one was bold and ruthless in his thinking, Aki thought. Thinking outside the box and exploring the unimaginable were common traits belonging to all genius tacticians. When such a person was on the defending side, they would be a fortress more impenetrable than 100 layers of bricks. But when they were on the side of invasion, they had the potential to spread the flame of war as wide and chaotic as they wanted, only limited by their morals. "I can't find any scent trails to track. Their scents are faint, to begin with, and the mugwort smoke clouded the rest." Aki noticed the way the boy tugged at his mask and scrunched his nose. He must have had the nose of a hound. No wonder he caught up to her when the rapids were splitting off left and right. "What now? What becomes of our mission? And what about them?" Asuma asked, tilting his head toward the direction of Aki. Upon hearing that, the other boy's frown deepened. Aki could read the signs of agitation, even just through the single eye that he had left exposed. "As much as I want to go catch those spies, we have no direction and the fighters we have aren't exactly fit for confrontation." The boy might have rolled his eyes at the mention of his teammates. "We'll return to Konoha as soon as possible, and the survivors." Aki understood that traveling with two civilians in tow would slow the band of shinobi down. The boy named Asuma had cast around his fingers and Aki could only speculate that the others would likely be the same, young, injured, more likely to die if shoved onto the battlefield. But the silver-haired boy had the goal of returning to Konoha burned into his eyes the moment he deduced the meaning behind this massacre. He could guess why the enemy shinobi had acted so desperately. In turn, he was worried about something left in his village. Would it be too much to wish for if he just left Aki and Haru behind to discard the burdens? Probably, but Aki could dream. What if she demanded that they had to bury the bodies of the deceased? Would that be enough hassle for him to move on? Or would Aki just be killing his patients? We have to take them back to the village. It's not safe for the survivors. Kakashi made up his mind. Stand back. It took Aki a moment to realize that the order was directed toward both her and the other shinobi. Following Asuma's example, Aki retreated further to the village gate, clearing a large radius around Kakashi and the pile of burnt remains. The earth rumbled without any premonition. For the second time since Aki arrived here, the first time being the lightning that pierced her chest, she saw the power of ninjutsu, the miracles that could bypass imagination and uproot nature. The ground caved in below the pile of corpses before the earth stirred like waves and covered the deceased like a blanket. The ground smoothed over itself afterwards, leaving nothing in the clearing except a boy out of breath. Do you have to be this brash, Kakashi? Asuma chided, rubbing his forehead with exasperation while teams of shinobi filed into the villages due to the commotion, with Haru not far away. You could always let your teammates help, you know. With their coordination and control, we'll never be able to get out of here. The boy wiped at his forehead and took a deep breath to steady himself. A few of the shinobi that were scattered on the edge of the village, however, looked like they couldn't decide if they wanted to bury their face in embracement or shout in objection. Ah, he must really want to get back home, Aki thought. There went her excuse, but there's a horse in the village. It's not meant for riding, but it'll be faster, Aki suggested before she made her way toward the lone stable in the village, all the while Kakashi scrutinized her actions. You know how to ride a horse? Kakashi asked. We shall see about that. Maybe I'll remember, Aki said without pausing her steps despite the gaze that bore into her back. There was one horse for the entire village, used for plowing the fields and transporting goods, back when the roads were still safe to travel. If things were just a little different, where the real Konoha nin arrived before the tragedy and convinced the villagers to relocate despite their fear. Maybe, the villagers would have been on the roads with the horse pulling the cargo. But now, the horse slammed its body into the wooden walls when Aki took a step closer. The bloody smell on her was probably agitating the animal if it hadn't already been driven insane by the scent of one-sided slaughter. I don't think this will work. Even if we can get it to behave by force, it'll be dangerous if you can't control it during the trip. Aki heard the boy, Asuma, next to her say. He looked at Aki, and then at Haru, before eyeing the horse with a hint of worry. To that, Aki said nothing as she walked to the wooden gate. The horse let out a high-pitched snarl when Aki untied the lead rope from the post. It banged its body onto the gate like a heavy tide rushing out of the dam. Maybe it was the pain, or maybe it was the leash, but the horse took a step back violently and Aki was pulled to the gate. She felt the horse digging its forelegs into the ground in preparation for a rearing kick. The young boy called Asuma was already waiting to intervene, but his leader merely watched on. Just as the horse was about to rise onto his hind legs, Aki pulled on the rope with monstrous strength. With a scream, the horse crashed back toward the ground against the force. Aki extended her hand and caught the side of its neck. A glow of ember lit up in her eyes, like a flicker of candle flame under the dim night, extinguished before it could be recognized. The shinobi around her watched in shock as the horse suddenly cowered despite being so rageful just a moment ago. It lowered its head and the guttural snarl turned into a soft whine. Aki ran her hand down the horse's pelt a few times, both in appreciation and in comfort. Carefully, she unlatched the wooden gate and led the horse out of the stable. Asuma took the reins from Aki, barely registering the events. Meanwhile, she pulled out the old set of riding supplies tucked near the stable. Kakashi said nothing as he observed Aki securing all the leathers. Some trials and errors were involved, but she figured it out in no time. After one last check, she hooked her foot into the stirrup and flipped her body over the horse's back. Aki extended a hand to Haru as she steered the horse forward. Still somewhat stunned and amazed, Haru took her hand, a little rigid in her motion, and allowed Aki to help her get up on the horse and sit on the saddle. Kakashi took one last look at the arrangement before he called out, "We're heading back to Konoha. Adjust your speed to match that of the horse and watch the civilians closely." Aki adjusted the length of the rope in her hand while the shinobi moved all around them. Some flanked the sides and others jumped onto the branches. "Hold tight," Aki let out a warning and waited for the arms to tighten around her waist. Then, she squeezed her thighs and the horse galloped forward with a neigh. "Maybe she's from those samurai clans in the east. I heard that they train their people in the art of weapons even if they can't use chakra. Oh, maybe she's a widow or a lady from a fallen household." Aki could hear the light gossips that traveled along with the murmurs of leaves. While the shinobi thought that civilians wouldn't be able to hear, Aki could catch their words with ease. She welcomed the stream of information, to be quite honest. What else did she resemble in this foreign world? What else could she be that would explain her abnormalities? "Are you in trouble?" That sound was closer and was said with much more clarity than those whispers up in the branches. Haru clarified a moment later, in a smaller voice, "With Konoha's shinobi, I mean." Aki thought about it and answered, "That depends on how I behave, I suppose, and on the boy who witnessed the impossible." How much of the tales he told his village and how he told them would determine how far she would be alienated from the definition of human and into the realm of monster. "You'll always be my sister. You can be Aki as long as you want," Haru said all of a sudden. Aki remembered that Haru once told her that she had nothing left that was worthy of being taken. All that was left was her life and by extension, her identity as a Fire Country civilian. Haru didn't know the extent of trouble that Aki got herself in, nor did she know that her vouch wouldn't have worked anyway because Aki had exposed too much. Yet, Haru still promised to help Aki with the only thing she had left. Lightly, Aki shook her head. "I'm not your sister, just a random person you found in your backyard. All you need to do is tell them the truth, Haru. I might have to leave you once we get to Konoha, but I'll be fine, and so will you." "I see," Haru whispered before putting her forehead against her companion's back. Aki could feel the exhaustion in her body washing out with those words. It was already a strength to be admired that Haru had stood through this ordeal on her feet. "Have you thought of a name then, something to be called your own?" Haru asked a second later. For a moment, Aki merely closed her eyes, letting the wind rush past her skin, bringing in the smell of the fertile forest. "Onyx, it's just like the color of your scales, too shiny." "You're right, then maybe ebony." "What do you mean it's the wrong shade?" "Well, pardon me if our human language is not as sophisticated as yours. Fine, let me think. I think I know the perfect name. That reminds me, when I saw you through the clouds, I thought that the ink had come alive from the canvas." The memories ended and she opened her eyes. "Sumi. I think I'd like to be called Sumi." "Su-mi," Haru articulated each syllable with care. It took her a second to piece together the meanings, but when she did, she let out a small laugh. "It sounds very beautiful. It fits you too, Sumi." As much as the shinobi boy wanted to race back to his village like there was no tomorrow, it simply was not feasible. The horse would have exhausted itself to death if it didn't take periodic rest, and Haru too wouldn't be able to stand riding the horse for too long. In fact, Sumi would say that most of the shinobi traveling with them were also in need of rest. From Sumi's perspective, they all looked to be children, no older than teenagers. She could see the exhaustion weighing on their bodies as they set up camps on the forest floor. As soon as their leader organized the guard shifts, those who were not assigned to be awake fell asleep the moment their eyes closed. "I know you're not asleep." Sumi opened her eyes when she heard that. The young shinobi, as always, was quite unrelenting. Letting out a sigh barely audible, Sumi turned her head towards the source of the critical gaze, careful not to disturb Haru, who had fallen asleep by the tree trunk. She eyed the other shinobi who was supposed to keep vigilance on the other side of the camp, but by all means, had dozed off to dreamland. "What will become of me once I go to Konoha?" Sumi asked Kakashi before he could wake his teammate up with a rock. "If they learned of my immortality, will I be imprisoned and experimented on like a beast?" The boy widened his eye, stunned by how blunt she was with her words. The objection of "no" was hot on his tongue, but 1 second had passed, and then 2, 3, he never pushed out a word as convincing as that. "Not all shinobi are like that." Kakashi settled for that instead. "Not all shinobi let fear dictate our actions. Not all of us want meaningless death and torture, even if we're knee-deep in a war." Sumi didn't claim to be infallible, but she had eons of practice in guessing a human's character and reading their nature. At that moment, she read the boy's nature. He didn't want to be one of those shinobi, one that turned a blind eye to meaningless death just because he was taught to deal with it. "If you truly are no harm to Konoha, there are people, like my teacher, who won't stand for that kind of treatment." The boy seemed to gain some confidence as he continued. "The war doesn't excuse everything," that's what he would say. Now that made Sumi curious, the teacher who taught the boy to have quite the ideals. After all, for a war to end, there needed to be someone who knew when to stop even in the highs of victory. "So," she said with honesty, "not going to lie, your village is starting to sound a little better." The boy might have given her a stink eye. "What? You can't expect me to have a good impression of Konoha when the first thing I remember of clarity is being killed by a Konoha nin," Sumi said with nonchalance, and as expected, a breath was caught in the boy's throat. It was quite unfair of her to evoke guilt in the boy when she knew from the beginning that her death was temporary, but she needed all the advantage she could get, for Haru's sake, and for her own sake. "You know that Haru should have never been involved in this, right?" Sumi changed the topic. She felt the warmth on her arm. Haru had fallen asleep while latching onto her, as she stared at the boy right in the eyes. "She doesn't belong in your conflict, nor does she belong in any trouble brought by whatever it is that I am." Sumi thought of running away when she was first caught by the boy near the river. She considered dropping herself back into the river, and she might have shaken the boy off her trail. She also considered fighting her way out. When she tamed the horse, she realized that it wasn't just her imagination when she caught up with the shinobi's speed and matched his power. Heaven's binding was disappearing, little by little, and came with it, her powers were returning. She wasn't sure if it was because of the time she spent in this world, the injuries she had gotten, or the drastic measures like death and resurrection. After all, if Heaven's presence truly did not reach here, then the energy that healed her and reconstructed her body could only have come from this land. Still, after much debate, she decided to wait. She wasn't sure if she could outrun the shinobi in her current state, now that an instance of death was not enough to fool him. Moreover, she wasn't sure what would happen to Haru if the shinobi had classified Sumi as a monster. However, it seemed that she might not need to worry so much about Haru when there were shinobi like the one in front of her in Konoha. "You don't have to remind me." Kakashi rolled his eyes, clearly finding the lecture annoying, especially when it was from a suspicious individual. We're not stopping more than necessary just because you're not resting when you should. That was a cue to shut up and go to sleep. Sumi listened, turning her head to the other side and shifting her weight back onto the tree trunk. A few seconds later, she could hear Kakashi flicking a stone at his teammate who was supposed to be awake. For Sumi, things were changing for the first time in eons. In fact, it started to change the moment she arrived in this land with shinobi, ninjutsu, and no heaven in sight. It was her own fault for not realizing it sooner, so she had no one else to blame when she found herself in a bind such as this one. But it wasn't just the world, she was changing as well. She was gaining back things that she thought she had forgotten, and it was frightening and novel at the same time. What would she become when heaven's marking was no longer etched into her very existence, but instead replaced by something of this world? And the humans of this world, she had already seen someone like Haru, and there were those shinobi too. In Konoha, there was a shinobi that the silver-haired boy revered, and there were also those that made the boy hold his tongue against her accusation. Sumi should really stop doing that, this interest in humans. After all, it was the start of why she received her punishment from heaven. The flow of energy streamed through her veins, arriving at her left hand that connected with the forest floor, unnoticed by the shinobi all around her. If her power really was returning, then those whispers she heard at the river bank were those from nature, the one that encompassed this world. Finally, she heard them again. Starting with an indecipherable murmur, like the rustling of leaves, the shifting of sand, and the flow of rivers all mixed into one, the sound started to grow until Sumi could understand the broken thoughts being repeated over and over again. Quote. Intruder does not belong here. Even if it was incomplete, that did not sound like a very nice message. Truly, if Sumi was 1,000 years younger, she might have felt heartbroken. Oh. Rin felt like she was submerged in waves, drifting, and eventually, maybe she would be washed ashore. A sharp noise sounded in the distance as if it was coming from across the sea. It started to grow louder, harsher, and more piercing. Rin's head was hurting, much like everywhere else on her body. The waves were slapping her around too violently for her bones to bear. She was like a broken ship on the ocean with no sail, left at the mercy of the storm until a tide slammed her into the shallow beach. Rin inhaled sharply. Her mind wasn't completely conscious, but she found her hand clawing onto something. It looked like another hand, and it was glowing a shade of green that was making her vision foggy. The cacophonous noises suddenly came into a sharper focus, resonating throughout the room in a rhythmic beat. With a rising feeling of panic, Rin realized that something was bursting inside of her, a flow more vigorous than she had ever experienced, turning her into something that she was not and never wanted to become. Relax. The voice was calming and Rin could barely register the magpie mask just out of her focus. You poor thing, being devoured by this power that's too great for you to bear. It felt miraculous when the waves that rammed through her veins seemed to turn sluggish like it was being frozen by icicles. It still somewhat hurt, like she was trapped by an iceberg, but it was helping, Rin swore. The soft green glow intensified and Rin heeded the words and relaxed. She released her grip on Magpie's wrist, noticing that the Anbu had barely flinched despite the bruises on her wrist. How many times? Why does it feel so familiar? But worry not, we'll help calm it down. Her words sounded hypnotizing and Rin's focus was already disintegrating under the warmth of the medical chakra. Before Rin's consciousness was swept under again, she saw Magpie's pupils through the mask, calming, peaceful, but so very static. Only Root can help you. Those words made a ripple in the water and were once again swept away by the current. Kakashi was never the one to feel homesick after a mission. To him, there were only two outcomes: he either lived to return to Konoha or he didn't. In both cases, the longing for a home filled with warmth, liveliness, and family that the older shinobi spoke of often, seemed redundant and foreign. But something crept up on Kakashi when he approached Konoha's gate. It stirred up his calm heartbeats and stung his muscles with both an ache and a sense of urgency. Kakashi could smell a familiar scent just on the other side of the village gate, merely a wall away. It brought a lot of questions and pushed him to walk faster, all to seek the answer that promised to quench his worry. Thankfully, what his nose couldn't answer was completed by his eyes. Rin perked up when she noticed Kakashi through the observation window. She gave him a wave to catch his attention before disappearing behind the walls. The gates opened slowly, revealing the girl that waited eagerly at the edge of the village boundary. Rin raised her feet, but something made her pause before she retracted her step. Kakashi couldn't help but let out a frown, but Rin merely yelled from the distance, "Kakashi, welcome back to Konoha." It was a little embarrassing for Kakashi to admit that for a moment, he almost forgot about the team of shinobi and the two questionable civilians he brought along with him and ignored the Aburame clan head that stood vigilant near Rin. All he thought about was that perhaps, he had a home to feel homesick towards that wasn't just an empty house with no warmth, no lively chatters, and no family. But the tapping of horse hooves against the ground and the stern look on the Anbu captain's face pulled him out of that state of complacency. Kakashi looked back and saw the one who called herself Sumi dismounting from the horse with a movement that spoke of experience, before helping the other civilian down as well. Perhaps the speculations his fellow shinobi gossiped on the way back were not unfounded. Kakashi thought she might have been a shinobi of a hidden heritage, but shinobi had no need for horses as a form of transportation when they could travel much faster in stealth. In that sense, a heritage in the land of samurai seemed plausible. But only on the surface, if Kakashi could forget about the resurrection from fatal wounds. Everything after meeting that woman felt like a dream to Kakashi, so much so that he didn't know exactly how he should have acted when the guards at the gate approached the two civilians for screening. So Kakashi pressed his mouth together and left it at that. Compared to the rudimentary examination by the Sharingan, Konoha had a much more precise protocol for making sure that a suspicious civilian aiming to enter the village was truly a civilian and not just a shinobi in disguise. Perhaps they'd be able to enlighten Kakashi. "Rin, are you okay?" Kakashi asked as he flickered to his teammate waiting inside the village. "Did they return your freedom? Did they give you any trouble?" Kakashi's gaze must have been piercing as he examined Rin down to every detail, making sure that there were no atrocious things like chakra-restricting devices cladded on her. To that, Rin merely returned a comforting smile as she replied, "I'm fine, Kakashi. I only woke up yesterday, but Minato-sense vouched for the strength of his seal and my control in front of the Hokage and his council," Rin explained with a pause. "I was released just earlier today, although, I'm not allowed to leave the village perimeter." Kakashi turned his head towards Aburame Shibi and the Anbu confirmed with a nod. Her chakra fluctuated a few times during the coma, but there was no sign of an outburst, so that convinced the Hokage of the success of the sealing. Unfortunately, Nohara-kun won't be allowed to leave the village, let alone go on missions as a shinobi, until she learns to protect herself as a Jinchuriki. There was a certain amount of calmness in the way Aburame-san disclosed all of this, and this calmness was reflected in Rin's acceptance of something that completely changed her life. This told Kakashi that this wasn't the first time such realization sunk in for Rin, but it was the first time that it was spelt so clearly for Kakashi. After a slight pause, Aburame-san added with a lower voice, "Elder Shimura didn't raise any arguments this time, but having root agents act as surveillance was one thing he won't budge." To translate, there were root agents hiding in the shadow, their eyes trained on Rin like they would for an object of danger. Just the thought of that made Kakashi's body tense up in discomfort. "How? It doesn't make any sense, just try it again." The sudden commotion outside of the village gate drew all their attention. Kakashi turned and saw the sensor stationed at the gate, a Hyuga, shaking his head in disbelief while the veins bulged under his Byakugan. The other guard gripped Sumi tighter on the shoulder in caution, but she didn't resist when he injected another syringe of chakra-stimulating drug, or liquid soldier pills, as some called them, into her arm. Once again, the Hyuga sensor widened his pearly eyes in disbelief, and immediately, Kakashi could relate. A vial of chakra-stimulating drug was a temporary boost to the chakra system. It could help a shinobi in clutch time, but it could also mess up any effort in chakra suppression when injected at such concentration. For a normal civilian, their chakra system would temporarily flux brighter before receding back to the dim, impoverished state, causing nothing more than a few moments of discomfort. But to a shinobi attempting to hide their chakra signature, their developed chakra system would flare up like a lighthouse, destroying any effort of deception. But the Hyuga, like Kakashi, must have seen the impossible, where there was no change in Sumi's chakra signature. It was a lifeless void from the beginning, and it remained one even after the stimulation. It was almost as if she had no chakra at all. The guards looked at each other, uncertain of what to make of the anomaly. This woman in front of them wasn't a shinobi, but she also wasn't a civilian either. There was no protocol that could account for this. Watch her. I need to report this to the Hokage, the Hyuga concluded. His Byakugan was still activated in an attempt to dispel any illusions that might have screwed with his reality. His teammate nodded, but before the shinobi could head out, a few shadows flickered in front of him and blocked his path. "We'll take the case from here," one of the figures said from behind his blank mask. His words were directed towards the guards, but his attention was no doubt on Sumi. The guards shouldn't abandon their assignments. The guards didn't hesitate to concede Sumi's custody to the root agents, the ones that were made to watch Rin, as Kakashi later realized. Anbu and Roots were ranked higher than the normal shinobi force because they were supposed to work directly for the Hokage. Now, sometimes Kakashi wondered if that was entirely true. "Jonin Hataki, you brought her back from the mission. Do you have anything to add?" The root agent asked as his sharp gaze landed on Kakashi. "It's as I wrote in the mission debrief I sent back with my summon. I found her as one of the survivors in the civilian village being attacked. I assess her to have no chakra, not even the level of a civilian, but she exhibited superior physique that's difficult to comprehend without chakra enhancement." Kakashi paused there, feeling his fingernails digging into the softer flesh of his palm as he arrived at the crossroad. Those were information already reported back to Konoha, but not the part on the resurrection. Kakashi could have written more in the scroll that Pakun carried back, detailing her appearance in the bloody skirmish that made Rin a Jinchuriki as well as her unbelievable return from the dead. But he didn't. So now, that secret remained with him. Sumi was looking at him as well. Her gaze was calm in such a contrast to the pressure emitted by the root agent. Kakashi didn't want to think about it, but nevertheless, their short little conversation during the trip back to Konoha resurfaced in my mind. Kakashi realized that what he revealed to the wrong audience would change a person's life forever. He had always known that rights were a fickle thing in a shinobi village, but it was never more apparent when he saw Rin again. People fear what they couldn't understand and what they couldn't control. So those entities were classified into the realm of weapons or threats, even if they were a sentient human. That was a part of the rules. But now more so than ever, Kakashi found that to be not good enough. That's all I can conclude. As for the rest, I'm as confused as you are. Kakashi pushed the final words out of his mouth. The root agent stared at him for a moment, before he nodded in courtesy and took hold of the woman. The other villager, Haru, looked worried. Even to an outsider, Root looked much more menacing and foreboding than the normal shinobi. But Haru stayed silent and didn't cause any trouble, having already been warned by Sumi that the questions were inevitable and were something that she must handle by herself. "Kakashi." Rin's voice pulled Kakashi's attention back and he retracted his gaze from the direction where the root agents left with Sumi. You look troubled, Rin whispered just within Kakashi's earshot. Really? I thought I'm pretty composed. Kakashi hoped that it wasn't that obvious to the root agents. Aburame-san had left already, clearly just here to warn Kakashi as a favor to Minato-sensei. He couldn't stick around when he wasn't assigned to Rin's surveillance. Kakashi was troubled. What if his decision, one that clearly deviated from the rules, lead to something irreparable to Konoha, to those that he cared about? What if it ends up like father's choice? Kakashi shook his head, both as a response to Rin and an attempt to shake off the fear associated with that memory. Between subpar rules and regretful decisions, Kakashi wanted neither, he wanted something better. As Obito had reminded him, rules were dead, but humans acting on them, making them, were not. If he could, he didn't want to settle for rules that weren't good enough. Rin, is Minato-sensei in the village? Kakashi asked instead and Rin nodded. Sensei is at the Hokage Tower the last I saw him. Rin paused for a moment, already caught on to the fact that Kakashi had things to say to Minato-sensei that were not for the outsider's ears. You should go visit Sensei and Kushina-san after a long mission. Come on, let's go to their house. That was what Kakashi wanted to suggest as well. Minato-sensei's house was warded with a large variety of seals. Root wouldn't be able to do anything other than waiting outside of the property. In fact, when Kushina-san opened the door and ushered them in with a smile, she might have glared into the distance, clearly finding the Root surveillance to be disagreeable as well. Kakashi-kun, Rin-chan, you came at the right time, Kushina-san said as she pointed at the boiling pot on the stove. I made too much of the stew, so I'm counting on your stomach to help me finish it. Rin let out a giggle at that. Knowing how good your cooking is, I'm sure Minato-sensei can finish it all by himself. That made Kushina-san laugh as she patted Rin's back fondly. Kakashi thought that he'd have to wait a bit longer before Minato-sensei came home. Perhaps it really was the power of Kushina-san's cooking, but more likely, Sensei probably sensed the location of his Hiraishin kunai aggregating in his house. In the span of a breeze, the yellow flash appeared next to the kitchen counter. Kushina-san wasn't even surprised. Oh, that smell is heavenly. Thank you so much for making the dinner, Minato-sensei exclaimed as he hugged Kushina-san with affection. Kakashi felt bad, really, because what he was about to tell his teacher was so outlandish and disconcerting that it might ruin his appetite, all of their appetites. Kakashi, you saw Rin already. That's great. How's your mission, and why do you look like you have some bad news to tell me? Minato-sensei's voice took a turn at the prolonged, and, switching from a light-hearted tone to one that showed his concern. Sensei. Kakashi had to take a deep breath before he could continue. It's going to sound crazy, but I witnessed something impossible. Oh. It was hard to say who was more confused, Sumi or the shinobi who placed a hand on her forehead, clearly in an attempt to do something, if the way he closed his eyes in concentration was any indication. But Sumi felt nothing. If there was a point in his action, she was not seeing it. The blonde-haired shinobi opened his eyes in a frown before he met Sumi's gaze. The confusion in her eyes might have insulted him or creeped him out. Either way, he retracted his hand as if her skin seared him. Just then, the door creaked open as an older man walked in with his cane. Still no luck, Jonin Yamanaka? He asked the shinobi and the latter shook his head. A quiet pause, before the old man asked again, perhaps we should try the amplifying orb. That seemed to make the blonde-haired shinobi shake his head even more. With all due respect, Elder Shimura, it's not my skill that's the issue. The mind-body technique requires one to connect with the chakra network of another mind, but there's simply no chakra here to be the target. The shinobi even cast another glance at Sumi. Disbelief was evident in his eyes, but he still stood by his conclusion. Whoever she is, it seems I can be no help. In that case, I should get back to my assignment. Despite the apparent hierarchy between the elder and the Jonin, Sumi sensed hidden animosity. More obvious from the Jonin's side, if she was to be specific. The blonde shinobi left soon after that and the door clicked close behind him. Now, Sumi figured, was where the real deal began. Young lady, have you heard of genjutsu? The elder asked out of nowhere as he moved into the chair facing Sumi, the one that didn't have the shackles built into the armrest. There was no table between them, meaning that every twitch in Sumi's muscle would be exposed to scrutiny. Sumi shook her head with no more than a frown of confusion. Genjutsu could spell a few different things depending on the time period. But in this world, consider her clueless. It's a type of ninjutsu that relies on the infiltration of the chakra networks in the brain. It creates illusions, makes the victim see an alternative reality, the man explained as he rested his hands on top of his cane. It's a common tactic used in interrogation, along with what Jonin Yamanaka had tried earlier. If you're smart, you've probably realized that my subordinate's genjutsu also did not work on you. There's no chakra circuit, no target, to be interfered with. The elder paused a little to let the words sink in before he finished his speech. You, my girl, are immune to the likes of genjutsu because your chakra network cannot be detected. I cannot ensure that you're telling the truth in an interrogation, at least by the means of ninjutsu. Not by the means of ninjutsu, you say. Now it made sense. What the blonde shinobi had tried earlier with her was likely something similar to a mind probe. But now that method of doing the interrogation had failed, Sumi wondered if they would move on to the harsher, less humane methods. Sumi could deal with the torture. Nothing could hurt quite like the rage of heaven, but it was the possibility of exposing her regenerative ability that made the warning alarm in her brain go off. What will you do to me then? Sumi said the first words since the initial stage of questioning. There was a healthy amount of fear and uncertainty that leaked out of her voice. Right now, she was not trying to be an ancient creature that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, she was trying to be someone that had lost her memory all the while feeling suffocated by the stress of being abnormal. It was very fleeting, but Sumi did notice that how small and helpless she felt in this interrogation pleased the elder. If you're an enemy, I'd order your execution immediately. An enemy that can't be made to confess the truth and be detected by our censors cannot be left alive in the village. The pressure in the elder's voice increased, making Sumi feel the grasp of imminent death. However, death did not come. What was offered instead was a spider thread. But if that talent belongs to Konoha, that's a different story. See, the rules for soldiers and the rules for leaders were different. The soldiers were taught to focus on the threat in order to minimize any mistakes. But for the leaders, particularly those that scheme to win in a conflict, they must be adept at finding weapons out of dangerous opportunities. The elder didn't leave time for Sumi to express her opinion, not that she planned to. Even if she declared her loyalty now, it would be met with suspicions. It's rare, but those that appeared to have no chakra network had been observed in history. Although, they're usually civilians with feeble bodies. Even if they're recruited as spies to infiltrate the enemy stronghold, their subpar physique dictated that they couldn't get far. They are invisible to censors, but not invisible in the physical realm. Elder Shimura was a good speaker. He spoke with logic and drew one in with his words, forcing one to think along the path that he had dictated. As he explained the usage of Sumi's abnormality, he was, no doubt, also observing Sumi, trying to catch any signs of a slip-up to suggest that this was not the first time she had learned of these facts, from her true allegiance, for example. Our shinobi identified the bodies of 3 attackers near your village. One was eliminated by the boy that brought you back, so care to enlighten me on the other 2. Elder Shimura prompted and Sumi knew that her decision, what she decided to tell and how that spoke of her, was being grilled on fire. I pulled one of them down the ravine when she was distracted by your shinobi. I was lucky to survive when I got washed up to the bank and she wasn't, Sumi answered. There were plenty of ways to check for the truth in her words, whether from the Konoha shinobi or from Haru, so she couldn't lie in gross details. But the finer ones, for example, the part where she got stabbed first, were something she had to take a gamble with. Haru couldn't have seen it clearly because she was behind Sumi. As for the shinobi, she was counting on the fact that the night was too dim to mark out the details when she was already soaked in blood to start with. The elder merely looked at her, waiting for her to continue, so she did. The first shinobi that we encountered, he attacked us first. But he let his guard down, so when he wasn't looking, I snuck up behind him and killed him. Upon hearing that, Elder Shimura let out a nod, an approval, a reassurance, a reward. Although, it was unclear if he was pleased by her honesty or her act of violence. Even if the shinobi is distracted, to be able to sneak up on one is no small feat. That's talent. Really, that almost sounded like a compliment, Konoha, and I believe in those potentials. I look at your future, not your past. Swear your loyalty to me, and no matter who you are before you lose your memory, the result of human experimentation, an outcast from a hidden clan, even a fugitive, you can be reborn under my guidance. It was tempting to say yes, not because of how convincing Elder Shimura's speech was, but because Sumi had no other option. She mustn't give him any reason to resort to the methods of torture or even execution. So the next best thing would be to bid her time and wait for her power to return. Maybe eventually, she'd be able to run away and never come back. But for how long? And what would she have to do in the meantime? After all, she wasn't being recruited as a prisoner, but as a weapon to be trained and used in wars. Thousands of years ago, she had inked a boundary in her heart, to never allow her power to be used for things she didn't believe in, to never let her power touch those that she didn't find to be deserving. The consequences of breaking such boundaries were devastating. To put it cruelly, Sumi didn't care for these shinobi wars. They could slaughter each other for all they wanted, that was the natural progression occurring in this world. She didn't believe in one side of the conflict, be it Konoha or their enemies, over the other, so she refused to fight for one side against the other. I am no shinobi, Elder Shimura. Sumi hesitated a little as if she was uncertain of what she heard in the passing. I don't know if I can achieve your expectations. I merely see the talent, but you're correct that the realization of any potential is a gamble. Except, Elder Shimura paused a little in suspense as the suffocating pressure returned in his voice, I'm gambling with my investment, and you, with your life. That was an ultimatum. If Sumi was smart, she should be. If she were to have any use for Elder Shimura, she'd realize that there was only one way she could walk, bar the option of death. It seemed that Sumi was just teleported from one path of doom to another that was equally treacherous. But at least, she comforted herself, it was walkable. If the door to the interrogation room had opened a second too late, then Sumi might have already agreed to Elder Shimura's solicitation. But just as the syllable was starting to form in her larynx, the door was pried open with an unstoppable force. Pardon me, Elder Shimura, but before you finalize any decisions, I'd like to discuss the custody of the person that Kakashi brought back to the village. Sumi turned her head to see the origin of that voice and she saw the man with bright blonde hair and a polite smile. I believe it's a little brash to put her on the track to Root, given how sensitive the things they have to deal with. Don't you agree? In her peripheral vision, Sumi could see the familiar mob of silver hair that followed behind the intruder. As for the focus of her vision, she was no doubt staring quite rudely. A stream of energy flowed in her body like a river being awakened from the winter, unbeknownst to everyone else in this room. She needed to check something and the pull from the energy indeed confirmed for her. The shinobi in this world could gather the energy known as chakra to perform feats akin to miracles, but Sumi realized that they were using a different system of energy than her, and consequently, different than the system in her old world. So rather than something familiar, they were more like foreign introductions. But this man in front of Sumi was truly a call back to her memory. In fact, he had a trait that should have been erased by heaven a long time ago, a trait where one had been touched by the essence floating between heaven and earth. He was an enlightened one. Oh. Minato wondered if the poisonous ink from the eight-tail might cause the slow-acting effects of delusion. He remembered how Killer Bee blew out a stream of pitch-black ink at him as the active battle came to a halt. Rather than an effective assault, it was more like the Jinchuriki throwing a temper tantrum at having been bested. Any score would have to be settled when the next bout of the battle started, but maybe Minato was being sabotaged in the meantime. Otherwise, it was hard to explain why he was hearing the most outlandish story from his most logical student, one where a supposedly dead corpse came back as a living being, right here in Konoha. But Minato dealt with Fuinjutsu, where imagination was a key part of any creation. The suspension of beliefs came a little easier for him than most. So, when he got over the shock and decided to take Kakashi's words at face value, he was quite glad to hear his student conclude, "Sensei, I want to protect Konoha and the people in it, but not like this." As soon as Kakashi finished his request, he was about to lower himself to his knees, to apologize for both his impulsive desires and what he was asking Minato to risk. But Minato was a step faster. He caught his student by the arm and pulled him up with indisputable force. "There's no need for that. You've come to me with a request, supported by a belief that you hold strongly. Moreover, to believe in a certain path means to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions." Minato paused just as Kakashi lowered his head in shame. Then, Minato let out a chuckle and rubbed the mud of silver hair at his chest height. "But you don't have to take that responsibility alone, Kakashi, for I do share what you believe." Minato, too, thought that there were many things, norms, rules, traditions, in the shinobi world that were not good enough. They were shaped by the unfavorable circumstances of wars around them, taught to children who had little time to understand their own ideologies. Exceptional soldiers might win the war, but it was those who knew what they believed in that would mend the aftermath from its wounds and build something better. "What would you like to do, Kakashi-kun? What outcome do you want?" Kushina asked with a softer voice. By this point, both Rin and Kushina had finally gotten over the initial disbelief. It was time to move on from the facts to the plan. I think that woman should be watched, especially if she had to stay in Konoha for the time being. In future observations, her lies and intentions might be revealed, or we will gain confidence that she spoke the truth." There was a slight pause as Kakashi glanced at Rin, then he continued. "If it's the latter, then those that don't belong in the shinobi conflict shouldn't be brought into it. No one should be executed or imprisoned just because they have an unusual power." Rin's breath halted a little when she heard that. Lightly, she bit into her lips and nodded in agreement. Rin was a gentle and kind kunoichi, one who would accept her sacrifice to protect those she loved, be it her teammates or her village. Rin wouldn't complain, and that was why Minato thought that the rules were not good enough. "Well, if you only reported on the abnormality of her chakra and her physique, then what Root wanted with her was probably not execution," Minato said while his students listened with attention. Knowing how Elder Shimura thinks, he'll first try to weaponize her abilities. You can't fear what you can control, and Root is completely within his grasp. Only when that fails, be it a lack of loyalty or a lack of value, will he move to eliminate the threat. But if Elder Shimura learns of her regeneration and resurrection, then that changes things. Minato thought that the woman's fear, Sumi, her name was, according to Kakashi, was not unfounded. While human experimentation was strictly forbidden in Konoha, the definition of human blurred when too many things deviated from what was comprehensible. Regeneration and resurrection from death, that was beyond even the realm of a Jinchuriki. To put it simply, Sumi leaned closer to what the shinobi knew of a tailed beast. Therefore, Minato concluded, it seems that time is of the essence. If she ever were to have a chance to be freed from the shinobi conflict, then she cannot be under the control of Root. So we have to snatch away what Danzo had set his eyes on. That old man does not let go easily, Kushina commented, not at all hiding her less than positive opinion of Elder Shimura. She never liked him much before with the outdated opinion that Elder Shimura had of the Jinchuriki. And with Rin's recent treatment, she was even more pissed at the elder. No, he'll make his case very convincing for the Hokage, after he had done the deed. In fact, Minato thought they'd only have a chance at uprooting Danzo's control if they do it before the deed was settled. So, we'll take Elder Shimura's idea and make it even more convincing. It seemed that they had made it on time when Danzo widened his eyes in shock at Minato's entrance. Namikaze-kun, no matter how popular you are with Hiruzen, it's unacceptable for you to barge into my interrogation. The elder was fuming. His voice reverberated in the cell, held back from shouting by a sheer sense of dignity. It's urgent, Elder Shimura, Minato replied, his polite smile fading as he glanced at the person who was the cause of Kakashi's trouble. The young woman had moved her eyes away, but Minato had definitely felt her staring. Things felt calmer than what Minato had expected. If it weren't for the chair that was designed to restrain the subject of interrogation, he'd almost mistake the atmosphere for a simple chat. What do you want? Elder Shimura composed himself, but the way he clenched his cane said that his anger was far from doused. Sumi-san, if I got the name correct, is brought back by Kakashi. Therefore, I think it's fair for her to be Kakashi's responsibility until her unusual circumstances can be sorted out, Minato said, and the elder let out a laugh with mockery. Her circumstances are not just unusual, it's suspicious. And you think your little prodigy boy should be put in charge of controlling her when he's the one that brought her back despite the potential for a threat? Danzo leaned back a little. The underlying implication was that Kakashi should have eliminated her on the spot. Then why is she still alive, Elder Shimura? If you fear so much for a person that has not acted against Konoha's favor. Minato shot back. I thought a Jonin like you would know that we should extract information whenever we can, Danzo replied. Rest assured, Namikaze-kun, Root is handling it appropriately. Oh, I don't doubt that Root is a highly capable, and selective, unit, born out of grueling training. Minato didn't want to waste more time with insults, so he cut through the facade and went straight for what the elder didn't want to admit. I'm not disagreeing with you on your goal of making her a weapon that can be used by Konoha, Elder Shimura. But there are other placements that might serve that goal better, both for Konoha and for the full utility of an asset. Minato didn't want to say those words, at least not in front of the woman. But to make a case more convincing than Danzo, an appeal to morality and human rights wasn't going to work well at this stage. Ah, it seems that Hokage-sama has just answered, Minato said as he felt the shadow clone he sent to the Hokage office returning. The look in Danzo's eyes was a mixture of disbelief and fury. It seemed that Minato was just getting in his way more and more these days. It was not intentional, but Minato sort of figured that a clash of ideologies this big was bound to crack further as time passed. Hokage-sama agreed with me, Elder Shimura. Recruiting someone of Sumi-san's circumstances into Root is way too radical. Minato passed to Danzo what the Hokage commented. I will put a seal on her that will enact punishment should she act in harm to Konoha. Both Kakashi and I will be responsible for evaluating how trustworthy she might be and how to best utilize her abilities. Just for the sake of it, Minato extended a step for Danzo to come down, even if it might contribute to the opposite. If she is best utilized en route, then that shall be where she belongs. Although, Minato's definition of the best placement likely weighed a lot more on the component of individual consent than that of Danzo. Elder Shimura let out a slow breath as he adjusted the grip on his cane. He set his exposed eye on Minato, asking, "First, you vouch your life on the sanity of that Nohara girl, and now, for a suspicious stranger. I certainly hope you have enough lives to spare around, metaphorically speaking." Minato heard Kakashi letting a hiss in anger as the boy stepped forward in response to the words laced with ill will. But the boy caught himself before he could lash out, remembering that they were so close to their goal. So, he calmed his rage by digging his fingernails into his palm. Knowing that he couldn't go against the Hokage's decision, Danzo switched his attention from Minato to the woman sitting on the interrogation chair, listening to their arguments in silence. "Sumi, I see your potential and I meant what I said. We'll meet again," the elder told the young woman as he motioned his agent towards her. "Release her and see them out." With two clicking of the keys, the woman stood up from her seat and rubbed the markings left on her forearms. Things were slightly awkward when she followed Minato and Kakashi out into the hallways, making no attempt to say anything. Minato wondered if he would cause any panic attacks if he just grabbed everyone and teleported them out. But no matter what, he figured that a warning was warranted. "Danzo, I heard that you found someone with no detectable chakra system who isn't sickly like a twig." Minato's warning never made it out of his mouth because it was interrupted by a third party that joined the chaos. "Orochimaru-san," Minato greeted as the pale-skinned man approached them from across the hall. The Sannin gave him a coy smile, but his eyes were already glued to Sumi, dissecting her with his gaze in order to delineate the rare parts. "Well, aren't you an unusual thing?" Orochimaru commented just as Danzo walked out of the interrogation room to deal with yet another uninvited guest. "Danzo, were you planning to hide her away en route so selfishly?" "I only act for the well-being of Konoha. Besides, she is no longer my problem." The elder left it at that as he walked away in the opposite direction. Orochimaru wasn't bothered by the unwelcoming attitude. He merely returned his attention to Sumi and said, "If you ever want to learn more about your unusual composition, I'll gladly help for the chance to learn more about the unknown." "Okay. That's enough before things start to get out of hand. Participation in research is voluntary, just saying." Minato made sure to point that out first, before he warned the woman, "I'm going to teleport us out of here. It might feel a little uncomfortable." There was the hint of a nod telling Minato that she was more than fine with being whooshed out of the interrogation unit. So Minato grabbed onto the two shoulders next to him and in the blink of an eye, the dark hallways were replaced by his dining room. The landing always took some time to get used to. Sumi pressed her fingers on her temple as she steadied herself in the new environment. "Is that a ninjutsu? Actually, that's not important." Just like that, Minato opened and closed his mouth without saying a word. Sumi looked at Kakashi, then at Kushina and Rin that were sitting next to the dining table, before her attention landed on Minato again. "You must be the teacher." "Oh, Kakashi mentioned me." Minato asked and the woman answered with a nod. He waited for her to offer more information or ask any more questions. She didn't, and the awkwardness grew exponentially more overbearing. "You must be feeling confused. You've only just arrived at Konoha, but you're a person that is already sought after by many," Minato joked in an attempt to break the ice. "It probably wasn't a good idea." A person, or an object?" the woman asked. There was none of the animosity in her voice, but the calm acceptance seemed to make the sarcasm more apparent. "Hey, Sensei is trying to help you, even though he has no reason to. If you stayed with Elder Shimura, then that's the life of an object," Kakashi interjected while rolling his eyes. Knowing the boy, he was ready to fight another battle defending Minato's honor when he couldn't do so in front of Danzo. Fortunately, the woman wasn't planning to give him a battle. "I am thankful." The easy admittance by Sumi made Kakashi unsure of what to argue against next. "And I suppose that I should thank you too for being selective about my secret." Upon hearing that, Kakashi let out a snort of annoyance. But he nevertheless turned his face to the side while he said, only a bit louder than a whisper, your immortality means nothing to me so long as you're not Konoha's enemy. Don't think too hard about it, it's detrimental to Konoha if the rumors of your regeneration get out to the other villages. That's not the reason which you told me before. The dishonesty that stemmed from pride and embarrassment in his student made Minato want to laugh and sigh at the same time. I apologize for saying that you're an asset to be used. It's the safest way to move you under my custody. Unfortunately, I would have to make what I proposed true, including the security seal, Minato told Sumi. He wasn't about to sugarcoat his words or the future reality. Please understand that I also don't trust you completely simply because I don't know who you are. But if you have no ill intention as you've said to Kakashi, then we'll find a way to return your life and freedom to you. Minato wasn't a saint. The duality of being a shinobi trained to protect Konoha, using violence, and being a dreamer existed within him. There was a moment of silence as Sumi processed his words. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, were you the one who taught the boy that the war doesn't excuse everything? Minato thought she'd care more about her immediate future, so he was a little taken aback. But yes, he did recall repeating that phrase to his students. Yes, I've said that before. The conversation died right there, but Minato was sure that the woman was judging, evaluating, even if the weight of her gaze was as light as a feather and had none of the pressure. Don't try anything funny. Kakashi eyed Sumi with suspicion when the extended silence had gotten too uncomfortable. What makes you say that? Sumi turned to the young boy and asked with a hint of amusement, because I stared at your teacher. Sumi's directness exposed Kakashi's inexperience in dealing with people. With disbelief towards how thick-skinned someone could be, Kakashi could think of nothing better to shoot back other than, he's married. I can see that, Sumi replied, nodding toward the photo of Minato and Kushina hanging on the wall. But it seemed that she was done making Kakashi explode as her attention went back to Minato. No offense, Namikaze-san, is it? Minato nodded and the woman continued. To me, you felt different. From him, she nodded at Kakashi, from them, then at Kushina and Rin, and from all the other shinobi in that interrogation room. As I've gathered so far, I cannot feel chakra just as I'm invisible to your chakra detection. But you have something different from their chakra, it's an energy that I can sense. As you may know, I'm a little lost as to who and what I am. I was hoping you might enlighten me. She laughed a little when she said that, but Minato could feel the frustration in her voice. That's a little vague to pinpoint. Minato would like to help out, would like to learn more to assess her, but as he said, nothing really came to mind when she put it so vaguely like that. Sumi nodded, finding that to be reasonable. She thought about it and added a moment later, I imagined that something other than chakra is powering my regeneration, so would you try identifying it for me while this mysterious form of energy is theoretically in action? It was a plausible plan, so long as Sumi didn't mind inflicting harm to herself, which by the looks of it, she didn't. Minato handed her a kunai while he prepared himself to act in case the woman tried anything with the weapon. It took Sumi 3 tries to find the appropriate grip on the kunai, suggesting to Minato that she was either a very good actor or she had indeed never used a kunai before. With little to no hesitation, Sumi pressed the sharp edge against the skin on her forearm and sliced down. A bloody gush opened as red seeped out of the wound like watercolor. But Minato's breath hitched not because of the fact that the wound was already trying to close, but because he had indeed felt the convergence of something towards the site of regeneration. The answer came to him shortly after. Unbelievable. It's natural energy. Pure natural energy, Minato exclaimed. Now it made sense why Kakashi couldn't identify the source of Sumi's power with his Sharingan even if there was clearly something at work. Natural energy, Sumi repeated with a frown. Her unfamiliarity with the concept was evident. It's very rare for humans to be able to feel, let alone use natural energy. Even for my lineage of practitioners, we can only use natural energy by blending it with our chakra in a certain ratio, therefore producing what we called senjutsu, Minato explained as Sumi listened. For a normal human to absorb natural energy in that purity without the chakra component, they would turn to stone. Return to nature, as my teacher called it. Surprisingly, to a highly trained Jonin like Minato, he wasn't able to read Sumi all that easily. But at that moment, he could see the thoughts that flashed through her face as she closed her eyes, something along the lines of, perfect, something that removed me further from the realm of humans. But that revelation actually brought an unexplainable peace of mind to Minato. Jiraiya-sensei and the sage toads at Mt. Myoboku always reminded Minato that the natural energy was only lent to humans as a blessing, it never belonged to humans. Perhaps it was Minato's instinct telling him that humans cannot control nature, making it less likely that Sumi was a product of scheming by any human faction. But then again, that was subjective and hardly the basis for unconditional trust. I appreciate the information, would appreciate it more if you'd keep that piece of news to yourself, Sumi said after a period of dead silence. She didn't wait for any answer or solicit any promise from them before she continued. Back to what you said earlier, it's reasonable, so I don't have any objection. It seemed like a roller coaster ride, to recover from that impossible revelation and think back to what they were discussing before, Sumi's immediate future in Konoha. Minato turned to Kushina, the request left unspoken in his eyes. Kushina gave him a sign that said, okay, before she grabbed the satchel of sealing supplies on the counter. Great, it'll just be a moment, Sumi-san, please follow me. Kushina waved Sumi along as they walked towards the bathroom. Just before Kushina closed the door, she left him a sentence. Heat up the stew in the meantime, will you, Minato? So, 2 hours past dinner time, Minato moved the pot from the oven to the stove and turned the heat on. He had some ideas as to what to do with Sumi, starting with finding out when Jiraiya-sensei will be back in the village. But he figured that everyone could use some food right now. He opened the lid and let the steam rise to the ceiling. Before turning to see his students, Rin had sat through the entire conversation with confusion while Kakashi looked exhausted by all the suspension of beliefs he had to do. With a comforting smile, Minato asked, all right, it's been an absolutely wild day. Who wants some stew? Oh, stupid kids these days have so much energy. The concept of fatigue should never apply to Black Zetsu, but dealing with Uchiha Obito nevertheless was very tiring. The young Uchiha boy had finally given in to exhaustion after resisting Black Zetsu's control for 2 days. Even then, it had no doubt that the moment it tried to do something with the boy's body, the boy's mind would reawaken again to fight back. Using White Zetsu's words, if it had heard the screams of Aranen, Kakashi, one more time, Black Zetsu would barf even if it was physically impossible for it to do so. Unfortunately, it was exactly those names that fueled the boy's relentless determination. A head morphed out of the wall, revealing the curious gaze of a White Zetsu, the one who had named himself Toby, as it stared at the boy half covered in a sheet of corrupting darkness. What did you find out? Black Zetsu's cold voice broke the white creature out of its trance. The spiral on its face twisted, as if disappointed by the fact that it wasn't the goofy boy. Honestly, what did Black Zetsu expect of the trash spat out by the god tree? She survived. Can you believe that, after a stab to the heart? I thought humans can't do that. Toby shouted and Black Zetsu winced at how loud it was as if Madara couldn't be awakened fast enough from his slumber. But as stupid as the white creature was, it was right about one thing, humans couldn't do that. Humans were predictable in the eyes of Black Zetsu. Their hopes, their wishful thinking, their desires, Black Zetsu had observed plenty of them in the eons of its existence. Humans were fragile in their bodies and even more so in their minds. Madara's plan, Black Zetsu's plan should have been perfect. He laid the foundation with his Rinnegan, and Uchiha Obito would come to carry the wheels and keep the plan going. Everything on the stage was set up perfectly, an act waiting to be performed. But it was all ruined at the last moment by an uninvited actor. And, it's been more than a week, but I don't see her with you, dead or alive. Black Zetsu said just as a second white Zetsu appeared through the walls as well. We want to, but it's scary. White Zetsu complained as Toby nodded in agreement. The aura around her feels really strange. We want to get closer to her too, but my intuition, poop boy there taught me the word, tells me that if I get any closer, I might go poof. Black Zetsu let out a hiss of annoyance. As usual, White Zetsu's intelligence and hence its reports left much to be desired for. But it sounded like that woman was both appetizing and poisonous to White Zetsu, like fire to a moth. It was too bad that Black Zetsu couldn't go out and investigate in White Zetsu's stead. It wasn't done with Uchiha Obito, and it had to continue to act as the manifestation of Madara's will, meaning that there was a limit to how much autonomy it could exhibit. Where is she now? Black Zetsu asked. The last time I checked, Poop Boy's teammate, Bakashi, took her with him in Konoha's direction, Toby answered. Then go observe Konoha. As per Madara's order, Black Zetsu concluded, and the two white Zetsu melted back into the walls with visible disappointment on their faces. It took Black Zetsu hundreds of years to find someone as ambitious and dauntless as Uchiha Madara. Black Zetsu wasn't about to let the plan die along with Madara's failing lifespan, so it could either find a way to extend Madara's life or it must make Obito its successor. That woman with unusual regeneration and vitality might offer some insight into the former. Black Zetsu wouldn't count on it when Madara was already stretched to its limit by the God Tree, but it was Konoha that could help Black Zetsu achieve the latter. The Uchiha, like their ancestor Indra, were emotional, stubborn, but so easily stained. Uchiha Obito, in particular, was as spotless as a sheet of white paper. Even without the stage set up by Kurigakure, all it would take was a trauma, a cruel demonstration by fate, to make the boy realize that he was not the hero in his dreams, but a sinner who shattered his own dreams. Those names that gave Uchiha Obito strength would soon drag him into the abyss. Black Zetsu just needed to bid his time for the next act, one that would inevitably come so long as Konoha continued to fight, whether against outside enemies or amongst themselves.